The wind howled through the Wyoming Territory, biting at the skin and slipping through the cracks of the weathered Conincaid ranch house. Troy Conincaid awoke to a sound, something that wasn't just the usual creak of the house settling. No, this was different. The low thump and the soft creak of wood shifting carried a deliberate weight. Troy's instincts kicked in immediately. With practiced hands, he grabbed the oil lantern on his nightstand, flicked the flame to life, and secured his revolver in its holster. The night was still, the air thick with the scent of dust and frost. He moved quickly, quietly through the ranch house, the creak of the wooden floor beneath his boots, the only sound. The cold outside hit him as soon as he opened the door. The night was dark, smothered by heavy clouds that blocked out the moon. The only light was the faint glow from his lantern, casting long shadows on the ground. Near the granary, he saw her, huddled beside a rough wooden cart, a woman. Her coat was thin for the season, and her dark hair clung to her face, wet from the cold. Behind her were two children, no older than 6 and 10, wrapped in blankets, their wide eyes filled with fear. They didn't cry, they just watched him. Troy stepped forward, holding the lantern high, and asked, "Who are you?" The woman didn't flinch. She didn't beg. She just met his gaze with tired eyes. And then she asked the question that would change everything. "Can you take us to town?" Troy looked at the crates piled beside her, then at the children who remained silent. He saw something in them, something that spoke of survival, of living with a weight too heavy for children their age. Something told him this wasn't just a request for a ride. After a moment, he spoke again. "What's in the crates?" "Everything worth saving," she replied. Troy's instincts told him to help, to trust. But there was something in her quiet strength that made him pause. People didn't carry crates around in the middle of the night unless they had something to hide. But he didn't push. "Not yet." "I'll take you," he said, his voice steady. "But only if you promise to come back home." The woman blinked, surprised by his demand. She didn't argue. She just nodded once. "I promise." Troy didn't know why he made that demand, but somehow it felt important. They weren't just going to town. They were making a promise, and whatever this woman was running from, it was far from over. A silent conversation. The wagon rumbled forward, the cold biting at their faces as they made their way through the barren landscape. The wind howled around them, filling the space with a constant reminder of how empty and isolated the world could feel. The lantern's glow flickered in the dark, casting long shadows over the path ahead. Troy sat beside the woman, Maria, his hands firmly gripping the reins. The children huddled in the back, wrapped in blankets, their eyes closed but still awake. The silence between them felt thick, like a wall that neither of them was willing to cross. Maria sat still, her face drawn and weary. She didn't speak, and Troy didn't press her. He could feel the weight of her silence, like she was carrying something far heavier than the cold night air. After a while, he broke the silence. "What's in the crates?" he asked again, his voice steady but filled with curiosity. Maria's gaze didn't shift from the road ahead, but her voice was calm when she answered. "Everything worth saving." Her answer didn't satisfy him, but Troy knew better than to push. She wasn't ready to share her story, and he wasn't the type to force someone to speak before they were ready. The wagon creaked on, the horses' hooves crunching on the frost-hardened dirt. Every mile they traveled seemed to deepen the silence between them, and yet it wasn't uncomfortable. It was a silence filled with understanding, a mutual recognition that there were things too heavy to say out loud. Maria's hand tightened around the edge of her coat. Her thoughts seemed miles away, lost in the world she was trying to leave behind. Troy didn't speak again, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. The weight of her silence spoke more than any words ever could. He wasn't asking for her story, not yet, but somehow he knew he'd hear it. In time. when she was ready, a promise in the dark. The night stretched on as they continued their journey through the wilderness. The cold was relentless, biting at their skin, but Maria didn't seem to notice. She sat still, her posture stiff as if she was used to the cold, used to the pain. Her eyes were fixed forward, but there was a weariness about her, like someone who had been running for too long, and now she wasn't sure what she was running toward. The wagon rattled along, the path growing rougher as they drew closer to the town of Dry Creek. Troy glanced at Maria, but she didn't seem to notice. She was lost in her own thoughts, her face set in that same quiet determination. "I'll take you to town," Troy said finally, his voice cutting through the stillness of the night. Maria didn't respond right away. Her gaze never wavered from the road ahead, but she nodded once, acknowledging his words. "You don't have to do this, Troy," she said softly. "You don't owe me anything." Troy didn't answer immediately. The words sat in the air between them, heavy with meaning. But he didn't need to explain himself. He wasn't doing this out of some sense of obligation. He was doing it because in that moment he knew that she needed him. "I don't," he said quietly, his voice firm. "But I'll do it anyway. I'll take you, only if you promise to come back home." Maria turned to him then, her eyes meeting his for the first time in hours. There was a flicker of surprise in her expression, but it quickly disappeared, replaced by something else, something softer. "I promise," she said, her voice steady. And in that moment, Troy knew she wasn't just talking about the ride to town. She was talking about something deeper, a promise to face the past, to confront the secrets she carried. And somehow Troy knew that promise wasn't just for him. It was for her, too. A ride through the cold. The wind howled again, louder now as they made their way toward Dry Creek. The horses' hooves were steady, their pace unhurried, but the weight of the journey was beginning to take its toll. The cold was becoming unbearable, and the darkness seemed to stretch forever. Troy kept his gaze fixed on the road ahead, but his thoughts kept drifting back to Maria. He could see the way she held herself, tightly, like she was afraid to let go, to show any weakness. The children in the back of the wagon had fallen asleep, but Maria remained wide awake, her eyes scanning the landscape as if she were waiting for something to jump out at her. "You never did tell me what's in the crates," Troy said again, his voice breaking the silence between them. Maria didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced over at him, her eyes flickering with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "Memories," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Things I can't leave behind. People who won't be forgotten." Troy nodded slowly, understanding more than she realized. He wasn't sure what kind of man her husband had been, or what kind of life she had escaped from, but he could feel the weight of it all in the air around her. The weight of secrets, of lost dreams, of broken lives. He didn't press her further. Instead, he focused on the road ahead. The journey was far from over, and there was no telling what awaited them in the town. But one thing was certain, Maria wasn't running anymore. She had stopped looking back, and with Troy by her side, she was finally ready to face whatever came next. The weight of secrets. The sun had begun to rise, casting a soft golden glow over the rugged terrain, but the light did little to warm the deep chill that had settled in the bones of both Troy and Maria. The miles seemed to stretch out endlessly before them, each one carrying more weight than the last. The horses' breaths came out in clouds of mist, and the frost-covered ground crunched beneath the wagon wheels as they made their way closer to Dry Creek. Troy didn't speak for a while, sensing that Maria was lost in thoughts she wasn't ready to share. He had been patient. He knew she carried a lot more than just the crates in the back. He had sensed it from the first moment he saw her. The guarded look in her eyes, the way her posture was always slightly tense, as if she were waiting for something to happen, waiting for something to go wrong. For a while, it felt like they weren't just traveling to town. They were carrying the weight of unsaid words, of broken pasts that didn't quite fit in with the future they were trying to build. Troy didn't ask questions, and Maria didn't volunteer answers. But Troy could feel the heavy burden she was carrying, even without knowing the full details. Finally, as the wagon made another bump in the road, Maria's voice broke the silence. "I was married once," she began, her words slow and deliberate, as if testing them out before allowing them to fall into the world. Troy's hand tightened slightly on the reins, but he didn't say anything, didn't interrupt. This was her story, and when she was ready, she would share it in her own time. "My husband was a man of power in town," Maria continued, her voice steady but tinged with something Troy couldn't place. Regret, maybe, or perhaps the distant memory of something good turned dark. "Everyone thought he was perfect, good with the people, kind-hearted, but there were things I saw, things I couldn't ignore." Troy turned to her then, his expression softening. "What kind of things?" Maria's eyes met his for the first time in what felt like forever. And in that moment, Troy could see the struggle behind her gaze. There was pain, but there was also strength in her eyes, something that had carried her this far, something that told him she would keep moving forward no matter what. "I saw the ledger," she said quietly. "The fake names, the money transfers, the women who disappeared, only to reappear in places they'd never chosen to be, places that weren't meant for anyone." Her voice trailed off, and Troy could see her hands clenching tightly around the edge of her coat. "I knew then that I couldn't stay," she whispered. "I couldn't keep pretending that everything was normal, that we were just another happy family in a town full of secrets." Troy felt the weight of her words settle between them like a quiet storm. It wasn't just the crates Maria was carrying. It was truth, the kind of truth that could destroy everything if it was revealed too soon. "Did he know you found out?" Troy asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. Maria nodded. "He knew, and he didn't care. In his eyes, I was just another part of his world, something to be controlled, something to be kept quiet. When I found the map, I knew I had to leave, not just for me, but for my children." The silence between them grew thick and heavy. Troy could feel the weight of her past pressing on him, but he didn't pull away. He didn't turn his back on her. "You're not alone anymore," Troy said, his voice steady. "You have a chance to make it right. We'll make sure the truth comes out." Maria turned to him, a flicker of something softer in her gaze. She didn't respond at first, but her silence spoke louder than any words ever could. "Thank you," she said after a long pause, her voice barely audible in the wind. Troy gave a small nod, his hand still resting on the reins. "We're in this together now, Maria, and we'll see it through, no matter what." A town with secrets. As the wagon rolled into Dry Creek, the town felt suffocating in its silence. The streetlights flickered dimly, casting long shadows across the few buildings that lined the main road. The town, despite its outward simplicity, carried the weight of something far darker than its sleepy facade. Let on Maria's body stiffened as they entered the town, her eyes scanning every corner, every doorway, every person who passed by. Troy could feel her tension, and he knew that for Maria, Dry Creek wasn't just a town. It was a place of hidden memories, of secrets buried deep within the walls of the homes and the people who lived there. The streets were mostly empty, save for a few straggling figures bundled up against the cold. The night was quiet, but there was an uneasy stillness in the air, as though the town was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Troy glanced at Maria, and he could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her hands gripped the edge of the wagon seat. This town had more ghosts than just the ones that lingered in the past. Lucius Gray was here, and Maria knew that better than anyone. As if on cue, Lucius appeared at the end of the street. His tall figure was silhouetted against the low light. his eyes immediately locking onto Maria's. A slow grin spread across his face, but it was cold and knowing. "Maria," he said, his voice smooth like he had all the time in the world, "I see you're back. Thought you could outrun your past?" Troy stood up, his hand instinctively moving to the revolver at his side, but Maria placed a hand on his arm, stopping him before he could act. "I'm not running anymore, Lucius," Maria said, her voice steady but filled with resolve. "And I'm not afraid of you." Lucius chuckled darkly, dismounting his horse and stepping closer to the wagon. "You should be," he said, his tone taking on an edge. "You think you've won? The game isn't over yet, Maria. You're just a pawn, and pawns don't get to change the rules." Troy stepped forward, standing between Maria and Lucius. His gaze was hard, unyielding. "You're done here, Lucius. Stay away from her." Lucius smirked. "You think you can protect her? You're just another man with too much pride and not enough sense. She's already been marked, Troy. She's already lost." Troy didn't respond immediately. Instead, he stared down Lucius, his stance firm. "We'll see about that." Lucius gave a final mocking smile before turning away. "2 days, Maria," he called over his shoulder. 2 days to make up your mind. After that, it's too late." As Lucius disappeared into the darkness, Maria let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. She turned to Troy, her face a mixture of exhaustion and determination. "He won't win, Troy," she said, her voice low but fierce. "Not this time." Troy nodded, his jaw clenched. "No, he won't." But even as they turned the wagon toward the boarding house, Troy couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking straight into a trap. Lucius Gray wasn't the only threat lurking in Dry Creek, and he wasn't the only man Maria had to worry about. The deal with the devil. As the evening deepened, Troy and Maria made their way through the winding streets of Dry Creek, pulling the wagon to a stop in front of a modest boarding house tucked at the edge of town. The warmth from the building seemed like a distant promise, but nothing felt warm in the air between them. Maria's heart was heavy with the weight of what Lucius had said, but there was something deeper lurking under her calm facade. Troy could sense her tension even if she tried to hide it. He didn't push, though. He couldn't pretend to understand the full extent of the danger she was in. But the one thing he knew was that Maria wasn't just running from Lucius. She was running from the entire system of corruption that had been built around her, a system far darker than she could ever have imagined. They had arrived at the boarding house, but Troy knew the danger wasn't over. He could still feel Lucius's presence hanging over them, thick in the air like smoke, suffocating and close. As they moved toward the entrance, Troy noticed a few figures lingering by the windows, their eyes flicking to them as they passed. He didn't like it. There was something about Dry Creek that felt off, like the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something to break the silence. Inside the boarding house, they were greeted by a kindly woman who led them to a small room in the back. Away from the prying eyes of the town, Troy could feel the tension in the room as Maria sat on the bed, her gaze distant, lost in thought. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Troy," Maria murmured, her voice quieter than usual. Troy turned to face her, his expression softened. "You don't have to keep running," he said firmly. "This is your chance to stop hiding from the truth. You've already made it this far." Maria looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude but also fear. "I can't just let him win," she said, a hint of steel in her voice. "I can't let him win, not after everything he's done. But I don't know how to fight this, Troy. I don't have enough to go up against Lucius Gray and the men who have the law in their pockets." Troy stepped closer, sitting beside her on the bed. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a steady presence she had come to rely on. "You're not alone in this anymore. You've got me. And as long as I'm standing here, I'll fight with you whatever it takes." Maria swallowed, trying to keep her emotions in check. She didn't have to speak for Troy to understand. They weren't just fighting for truth anymore. They were fighting for their future, for the freedom of the woman and children she had protected. And they were fighting against a system that would rather see her disappear than have her testify in court, the fight to stay silent. The following day dawned, but the darkness that hung over Maria had only deepened. She wasn't sure if the weight on her chest was the cold air from outside or the burden of her choices. It was hard to tell, but either way, the decision had been made. She would go to the sheriff's office. She would face the system head-on, and she would no longer let fear dictate her future. Troy was quiet as he led her down the town's dirt road toward the sheriff's office. He wasn't sure how to help her, but he knew one thing for certain. She was stronger than she realized, and no matter what happened, he wouldn't let her face this alone. They reached the sheriff's office just as the sun was rising, casting a faint glow over the modest building. Maria hesitated for a moment, her hand resting on the doorframe, as if steeling herself. Troy, standing close by, gave her a silent nod, an unspoken assurance that she wasn't walking into this alone. She pushed the door open, the familiar jingle of the bell above the door cutting through the heavy silence. Inside, Sheriff Caleb Warrow looked up from his desk, his eyes sharp and calculating, as though he was already sizing up Maria. "Maria," he said, his voice a mix of caution and something else that Troy couldn't quite place. "Didn't expect to see you here." Maria didn't waste any time. "I need to speak with someone about Lucius Gray," she said, her voice clear, each word coming out steady. She wasn't asking for help. She was demanding it. Warrow eyed her for a moment, the tension in his gaze growing. He knew exactly who Lucius was, and he knew better than most the kind of power the man had over the town. There was no love lost between them, but he also knew that Maria's claim was a dangerous one. Lucius wasn't just a local troublemaker. He was tied to people much bigger than him, and there was no telling who might be listening. "I'm a witness to what he's done," Maria continued, not waiting for the sheriff to speak, "and I have proof, evidence that could change everything." She placed a leather-bound ledger on the desk, the one she'd carried with her since she left her husband's house. The ledger held more than just names and figures. It held lives, suffering, and a story that needed to be told. The sheriff didn't reach for the ledger immediately. He stared at it, his fingers hovering just above it, and Troy could see the hesitation in his eyes. It was the kind of hesitation that spoke of fear of what could happen if they uncovered the truth. "Where'd you get this?" the sheriff asked, his voice low, careful. "It's mine," Maria said, her voice unwavering. "It belongs to me, and it belongs to the women who never got the chance to speak. I'm here to make sure their voices are heard." The sheriff's gaze moved from the ledger to her, then back to the ledger. He seemed to be weighing his options, calculating the risk. "Do you have any formal identification?" he asked, his eyes narrowing. Maria's shoulders sagged slightly as she shook her head. "I lost everything when I escaped." Troy could see that Maria was running on empty. Her strength was beginning to fade, and the weight of her past was still too heavy for her to fully release. But Troy stood beside her, unwavering. His presence alone was a reminder that she wasn't alone, that they had a chance to fight this. Sheriff Warrow finally nodded, albeit reluctantly. "I'll look into it," he said, though his voice lacked the conviction Maria needed to hear. "But this is Lucius Gray we're talking about. If you're telling the truth, it's going to cause a stir. You're not the only one with a stake in this." Maria nodded, her face hardening with resolve. "I'm not asking for anything but justice," she said, "and I'll fight for it, no matter the cost." The call to fight back. The next few hours were a blur. Troy and Maria made their way to a warehouse on the outskirts of town, a safe house of sorts where they could lay low while they waited for the truth to unfold. The air inside was thick with dust, and the faint smell of old grain and wood lingered in the corners. It was the kind of place that had seen years of hard work, but was now just a shadow of its former self. But for Maria and Troy, it felt like a safe haven, a place where they could plan their next move. Maria didn't sleep. Instead, she sat at the edge of a worn wooden crate, staring at the list of names and dates in the ledger. These weren't just names to her. They were faces, lives that had been stolen. She had to do this for them, for the women whose stories would never be told unless someone spoke out. Troy watched her, his expression softening as he approached. "You don't have to carry this alone," he said, his voice low but steady. Maria didn't look up, but she nodded, almost imperceptibly. "I can't keep running from it, Troy," she said softly. "I have to bring this to light. I have to make sure Lucius Gray and the others pay for what they've done." Troy's heart ached for her. He knew how heavy her burden was, but he also knew that she wasn't alone anymore. "We'll fight for it," he said, his voice firm, "and we'll make sure the truth comes out." The wind howled outside, but inside the warehouse there was a stillness. It was the calm before the storm, the moment before everything changed, a promise fulfilled. As the days passed, things began to fall into place. The documents Maria had carried, the names she had protected, were finally starting to make their way into the hands of the right people. It wasn't easy, and the threats from Lucius Gray only grew more frequent, but Maria had made a choice. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. The day of the trial arrived. The small courthouse in Carver's Bluff was packed, filled with people who had once turned a blind eye to the truth. But Maria's voice broke through the noise, clear, strong, and unyielding. She testified to everything she had witnessed, to the lives that had been destroyed, the evidence she had gathered in the crates, the photographs, the ledger. It all came out. Lucius Gray was arrested, his empire of corruption beginning to crumble. Maria had won. The fight wasn't over, but this was a victory for the women who had never been able to speak, for the children who had suffered in silence. Back at the ranch, things were beginning to settle. The wind had stopped howling, and the sun was setting on the Wyoming hills. Troy and Maria stood on the porch, their hands resting by their sides, and for the first time in a long time, there was peace. Maria turned to Troy, a small smile tugging at her lips. "Can you take us to town?" she asked. Troy glanced at her, his eyes soft with affection. "Only if you promise to come back home." Maria smiled, her heart full. "I promise," she whispered. And this time, she knew it wasn't just about returning to the ranch. It was about a life they had rebuilt together, a home that was more than just a place. It was a promise.